The lake used to be the quietest place on the property. Morning fog sat low over the water the way it always had, soft, still, almost untouched. For years the only sounds out here were wind through the reeds and the faint splash of fish near the dock. But the morning I came home, the water was humming. Not rippling. Not moving. Humming. A metal platform floated 30 yards from shore, bolted into pilings driven straight through the lakebed. Thick black pipes ran from the platform across my shoreline and disappeared underground toward the neighborhood greenbelt. A locked chain-link fence circled the pump, and a white sign hung on it. Ridgeview Community Irrigation Utility, HOA property. I stood there counting damage the way I used to inventory supply losses overseas. Dock torn out. Shoreline cut. Electrical trench dug across the access path. Water level already down nearly a foot. Rough estimate, somewhere around $180,000. Behind me, two neighbors whispered while recording on their phones. The HOA president walked over with a confident smile and folded arms. "Absentee owners don't get to control community resources," she said loudly, making sure the others heard. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just took out my phone and recorded the intake pump pulling water out of my lake. Because the moment I saw those industrial flow gauges, I realized something she didn't. They hadn't just trespassed. They had connected themselves to a regulated water system. And when that matters, local rules stop applying. I watched the pump spin faster as the waterline crept lower against the rocks. Then I asked the only question that mattered. Why would a neighborhood HOA need industrial water permits just to use a private lake? If you believe rules apply to everyone, even the people who think they run the neighborhood, stay with me. This didn't get solved with shouting or threats. It took paperwork, patience, and one detail they never expected anyone to read. I didn't buy the property for the house. I bought it for the water. The lake sat at the back edge of the land, tucked behind a line of cedar trees that blocked the road and most of the neighborhood from view. My father and I used to fish places like this when I was a kid, quiet banks, no docks, no crowds, just patience and time. After he passed, I wanted one place that didn't move, didn't rotate duty stations, didn't change every 3 years. So I saved deployments instead of spending them. When I finally closed on the land, the survey showed the shoreline entirely inside my boundary markers. The agent called it a private natural basin. I called it permanent. The neighborhood beside it was newer, large homes, manicured lawns, and a homeowners association that advertised environmental harmony. Most people kept to themselves. Friendly waves, short conversations, nothing dramatic. The HOA president, however, treated the community like a development project still under construction. She was a real estate investor who had bought multiple lots during Phase 2 expansion. Every conversation eventually circled back to property values, amenities, or resale appeal. Walking trails, decorative lighting, upgraded landscaping, always framed as improvements. The first small warning came a few months after I moved in. Survey stakes appeared near the tree line facing the lake. I assumed utility marking until they stayed there for weeks. Then a neighbor casually mentioned the board discussing a greenbelt irrigation plan at a meeting scheduled during my training rotation. I asked for the notes when I got back. They said nothing had been finalized. A month later, I deployed overseas. Before leaving, I set up mail forwarding and a camera facing the dock path, mostly for weather and wildlife, nothing serious. The property had been quiet for years. During deployment cycles, time compresses. Weeks blur into schedules and supply reports. I didn't think about the lake much beyond checking the occasional still photo on my phone. Then halfway through the rotation, the camera stopped updating. I assumed dead batteries. The next update I saw wasn't from the camera, it was a message from a neighbor I barely knew. "Hey, are they supposed to be digging near your shoreline?" I stared at the picture she attached. Fresh soil. Equipment tracks. Bright orange fencing. And the equipment was facing the water. If they were only landscaping the neighborhood, why were they working inside my property line while I was gone? I got back late in the afternoon. Long flights, borrowed time zones, and the kind of quiet exhaustion that makes everything feel slightly unreal. The driveway looked normal. The house looked normal. The lake didn't. The first thing missing was the dock. In its place sat a clean cut in the shoreline, gravel packed down where boards used to be. A trench crossed the yard in a straight line from the water toward the neighborhood fence, filled but still fresh enough to see the path it took. Beyond the trees, sprinkler heads rotated in steady rhythm across the community greenbelt. They were running from my water. I walked the shoreline slowly, recording everything instead of reacting. Thick PVC lines entered the lake below the surface and fed into a floating intake platform anchored offshore. A lock panel held electrical controls, already powered and active. On the fence post near the path hung a laminated notice. Ridgeview Water Resource Allocation, Community Improvement Infrastructure. Below it, a new section of HOA bylaws claiming the basin qualified as a shared environmental resource under Association Maintenance Authority. I checked the date. Adopted 3 weeks into my deployment. In my mailbox sat a stack of envelopes forwarded back to the property after the hold expired. Assessments, maintenance notices, and a charge labeled Utility Integration Contribution. The total due had already accumulated late penalties. I walked to the HOA office while the sun was still up. The president greeted me like I was late to a meeting I never scheduled. "We sent notices," she said, sliding a copy of the bylaws across the desk. The board voted unanimously. I asked for the meeting minutes. "Executive session," she replied. "Internal matters." I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I just requested the records in writing and left. Because if the vote was legitimate, they would show it. And if it wasn't, they wouldn't dare put it on paper. Why declare something community property unless you weren't sure you actually owned it? The next morning I started with the simplest step, neighbors. Not accusations. Just questions. Most hadn't attended the meeting where the lake supposedly became a shared resource. A few remembered an email about landscaping upgrades, but nobody could recall voting to tap a private shoreline. One neighbor quietly admitted the discussion had been framed as stormwater management improvements, not water usage. That was the first mismatch. I drove to the county clerk's office and asked for any filings tied to my parcel number. The clerk found one entry, Stormwater Enhancement Notice, Ridgeview HOA. Filed during my deployment. I requested the supporting documentation. She paused, reread the number, then printed only the cover page. The attachments, she explained, had been submitted digitally through a contractor's account and weren't immediately available at the counter. Her tone changed after she saw the survey map I brought. "Civil matter," she said carefully. "You may want legal advice." On the way back, I found a bright orange notice posted on my gate. HOA violation, interference with community utility access. Apparently, recording the pump from my own shoreline counted as interference. That afternoon, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door responding to a complaint. He walked with me to the water, studied the platform, then shrugged. "No criminal trespass determination," he said. "Looks like a property dispute." But he also photographed the industrial pump before leaving, longer than necessary. 2 days later, certified mail began arriving. First, a $600 maintenance allocation. Then, $2,800 in enforcement penalties. By the end of the week, a warning that continued obstruction could trigger a special assessment exceeding $14,000. I still hadn't touched the equipment. Instead, I started documenting. Daily waterline measurements marked on the rocks. Timestamped videos of the pump cycling on and off. Manufacturer plate numbers showing extraction capacity far beyond irrigation sprinklers. Satellite imagery archived from public databases proving the shoreline's original condition. Paper answered paper. At the clerk's office, I requested the digital attachments again. This time the staff member checked a different terminal, frowned slightly, and said the submission referenced a secondary filing number tied to a utility classification. She wrote it down for me. Then she stopped talking. When I called the next day asking about that number, no one could locate it in the public index anymore. Why would a routine landscaping notice suddenly be linked to a utility filing the county wouldn't explain? By the following week, the situation stopped being quiet. The HOA posted a bulletin at the neighborhood entrance. Private shoreline, restricted community infrastructure zone. My address was listed underneath. Neighbors who used to wave now slowed their cars instead. A few asked if I'd refuse to contribute to a community project. Someone mentioned property values dropping if the water feature got shut down. The story had changed. I wasn't a homeowner protecting land anymore, I was the obstacle preventing shared improvements. At the monthly meeting, the board openly discussed enforcement. The president explained the irrigation system had already increased landscaping survival rates and reduced municipal water costs. A slideshow showed greener lawns, new flower beds, and projected resale gains for Phase 2 houses. Then she displayed a line item. Pending legal action, non-compliant parcel owner. That was me. I didn't interrupt. I just recorded. Afterward, a certified envelope arrived labeled Notice of Lien Preparation. The balance had climbed past $22,000 with projected foreclosure review if unpaid. Still, I hadn't touched their equipment. Instead, I used the secondary filing number from the clerk's office and contacted the State Water Resources Department. After a few transfers, someone finally confirmed the number corresponded to a registered irrigation withdrawal project, categorized as a utility-type water use, not landscaping. The representative paused when I asked about the source location. Surface basin feed, she said carefully. Requires ongoing reporting. I asked who filed it. She read the contractor's company name, the same one managing the neighborhood expansion. Not the HOA. That meant the project wasn't just an improvement. It was operating under a regulatory category normally reserved for controlled water extraction systems. Back home, I reviewed the pump specifications again. Flow rate, intake diameter, operating schedule, all consistent with regulated withdrawal, not decorative watering. 2 days later, the board scheduled a hearing to finalize the lien. I attended, said nothing, and placed a single request on record: copies of all permits authorizing water removal from the basin. The attorney representing the HOA replied they had appropriate approvals. He didn't say from where. Because if a neighborhood irrigation project was registered like a utility, it wouldn't only answer to the county, it would answer to someone much higher. Why would a simple HOA landscaping project need to report water usage like an infrastructure system? By that point, the paperwork stack covered half the kitchen table. Certified notices. Assessment schedules. A lien timeline counting down in precise legal language. Every day the balance increased whether I responded or not. It would have been easier to pay it, sell the place, and leave the problem behind with the next owner. No court dates. No letters. No more explaining to neighbors why I kept measuring rocks at the shoreline. For a couple of nights I seriously considered it. I'd spent years moving base to base, temporary housing, temporary storage, temporary addresses. This property was supposed to be the one fixed point after rotations ended. But fixed points cost energy to defend, and the board clearly had more time than I did. Then I remembered why documentation mattered in the first place. In logistics, mistakes don't fail loudly. They fail slowly. A wrong number copied once becomes a missing shipment weeks later. You don't argue with the mistake, you trace it back to the line where it stopped matching reality. So I stopped looking at the fines and started looking only at dates. Meeting date. Construction start date. Filing submission date. Registration approval date. Laid side by side, one column didn't align. The irrigation registration had been acknowledged before the HOA meeting that supposedly authorized the project. Meaning approval came after operation. Someone had built first, justified later, and hoped the order wouldn't matter. I leaned back in the chair and read the sequence again, slower this time. If authority depended on that timeline, the entire project rested on a moment that legally didn't exist. But invalid timing alone wouldn't shut down an operating system. It only told me where to keep digging. If they didn't actually authorize the project when they said they did, who had the authority? They never asked. The HOA finally responded to my written request a week before the lien hearing. Not everything, just enough to look cooperative. They provided meeting minutes approving the irrigation project, stamped and signed. At first glance it looked routine: motion introduced, vote recorded, contractor authorized. But the formatting didn't match the association's previous records. Older minutes used numbered agenda items and recorded discussion summaries. These were shorter, cleaner, and oddly specific, almost like they were written after the outcome was already known. I compared the timestamp on the document metadata to the date printed on the page. Created 2 weeks after the meeting supposedly occurred. Then I checked the contractor permit from the state registration office. Filed 3 days before the meeting. Construction photos from my neighbor's message showed excavation already underway the day before the vote. Approval had come last. The board hadn't authorized the project, they had documented it after it existed. At the next hearing I calmly asked one question. Who authorized the contractor to withdraw water before the association voted? Their attorney answered quickly. The association acted within its governing authority. He didn't name the authority. Because the permits they relied on only covered landscaping usage, not water extraction infrastructure. The paperwork justified ownership, but not operation. And if no local approval covered the actual activity, then the authorization had to come from somewhere else, or nowhere at all. The room shifted from confident to careful. If the HOA never legally approved the water withdrawal, what agency's permission did the pump actually require? The filing number the clerk almost didn't give me kept bothering me. Every document the HOA produced pointed downward: bylaws, community votes, architectural authority, local layers of control stacked on top of each other. But the irrigation registration pointed sideways, into a regulatory system they weren't mentioning out loud. So instead of calling the county again, I called base legal assistance. I didn't frame it as a neighborhood dispute. I described equipment specs, withdrawal rates, and a surface basin connected to a mapped drainage channel. The attorney on the line asked me to send photos of the pump plate and a copy of my survey. An hour later she called back with a different tone. Your lake isn't classified as isolated water, she said. It feeds a flood control channel downstream. She sent me a federal watershed map overlay. A thin blue line left the far end of the basin, passed under a county road culvert, and connected to a regional runoff system maintained under federal oversight. It wasn't obvious standing on the shoreline, just a shallow outflow ditch most of the year, but legally it linked the basin into a managed waterway. That changed everything. Because once mechanical equipment actively withdraws or redirects water from a connected basin, the activity stops being landscaping and becomes alteration of a regulated channel condition. And alteration required a specific authorization. Not a county notice. Not an HOA vote. A federal minor water alteration permit issued before installation. I searched the federal database she referenced. No permit existed under the HOA name. No permit under the contractor. No permit for the parcel at all. Which meant the state irrigation registration they proudly relied on didn't grant permission, it triggered oversight. The pump capacity mattered now. Based on manufacturer flow rates and the runtime I'd been logging, the system was moving enough volume daily to change downstream runoff calculations. The moment they activated it, reporting requirements began automatically, whether they knew it or not. I sent the measurements and coordinates to the contact the attorney provided. 2 days later the HOA scheduled their lien confirmation hearing. 1 day later they received a notice they didn't expect. A federal inquiry requesting documentation for authorized withdrawal structures at the property location. They still proceeded with the meeting. Their attorney outlined unpaid assessments and noncompliance. The board nodded confidently until someone handed the president an envelope delivered minutes earlier. She read only the first page before passing it to counsel. He stopped mid-sentence. I recognized the form header from the database. Request for proof of authorization to operate mechanical withdrawal equipment affecting regulated drainage. He asked for a short recess. Voices in the hallway lost their certainty. Because this wasn't about ownership anymore. Even if the HOA somehow proved the lake belonged to everyone, operation of the pump depended on a permission none of their paperwork addressed. Local authority governs property. Federal jurisdiction governs connected waterways. And jurisdiction doesn't care who started the project, only whether it was approved before it began. When the hearing resumed, their argument had changed from enforcement to delay. They needed time to clarify regulatory scope. But regulatory scope had already been clarified the moment they installed the intake pipe. Every day the pump ran counted as an independent violation under reporting thresholds they never knew existed. They had tried to justify the project upward through paperwork after building it. Instead, the paperwork had pulled attention downward from above. The board thought they were managing a neighborhood utility. They had accidentally created an unpermitted water control operation inside a monitored watershed. And once a system enters that category, stopping it doesn't require a vote, it requires compliance proof first. The notice didn't accuse them yet. It asked a simple question. Provide authorization for operation. They didn't have one to provide. What happens when a private HOA discovers its project falls under federal jurisdiction it never asked about? The inspection was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 8:30 the shoreline looked like a press conference. Board members clustered near the pump platform, speaking in tight circles. The HOA attorney stood with a legal pad, rehearsing language about community benefit and misinterpretation of scope. A few neighbors lingered behind the fence, curious but cautious. At 8:57 two county vehicles arrived first. Clerk representative. Environmental compliance officer. Then, 5 minutes later, a white federal pickup rolled down the gravel access path. The mood changed immediately. No lights. No sirens. Just a calm, quiet authority that didn't ask permission to step past the orange fencing. The federal inspector introduced himself, shook no hands, and requested 3 things. Installation date of the pump. Volume capacity. Authorization documentation. The HOA president spoke first. This is a community irrigation enhancement. It's entirely within association rights. The inspector didn't debate that. He crouched near the intake housing, read the manufacturer plate, and wrote down the maximum withdrawal rate. Then he walked to the outflow channel at the back of the basin and measured the drop against previous seasonal markers. He asked again, "Where is the federal authorization for mechanical withdrawal?" The attorney produced the state irrigation registration. The inspector read it once, flipped the page, then handed it back. "This confirms reporting classification," he said evenly. "It does not grant withdrawal authority." Silence settled in layers. The HOA president tried a different angle. "The lake is within our planned development boundary." "That may be a property question," the inspector replied. "This is a regulatory one." The county environmental officer added quietly, "Volume thresholds here trigger watershed oversight." Neighbors started whispering. A few phones lifted discreetly. The inspector turned to me. "Are you the recorded parcel owner?" "Yes." "Did you grant access for this installation?" "No." He nodded once and wrote something on his clipboard. Then he addressed the board. "Operation of unpermitted withdrawal equipment connected to a regulated drainage channel requires immediate cessation pending compliance review." The pump was still running. The intake churned water steadily through the PVC line toward the neighborhood sprinklers, which were misting in the distance under a bright morning sun. The inspector gestured toward the control panel. "Shut it down." The HOA president hesitated. "Is that an order?" "Yes." The contractor, who had been silent until now, stepped forward and flipped the switch. The humming stopped. For the first time since I returned, the lake surface went still. The inspector explained next steps: documentation submission, volume calculations, restoration assessment if necessary. Each phrase sounded procedural, not dramatic, but the implication was clear. Without authorization, the project wasn't merely disputed. It was exposed. The HOA attorney attempted one final pivot. We relied on internal governance and state-level classification in good faith. The inspector answered calmly. Jurisdiction isn't optional. Then he turned to leave, but paused. One more thing, he added. Every day of operation counts separately. That sentence landed heavier than any accusation. Because daily operation meant daily exposure. The county clerk representative confirmed the lien process would pause pending regulatory review. The environmental officer noted that downstream flow impact calculations would be required retroactively. Neighbors who had once viewed the pump as an amenity now stared at it like a liability. The president looked toward me, frustration replacing confidence. This could have been handled internally, she said. I kept my voice steady. You didn't take my lake, I replied. You tapped a regulated waterway. The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Authority collapsed quietly, the way it always does when it's built on assumption instead of approval. The board members avoided eye contact. The contractor began discussing removal logistics under his breath. The sprinkler heads in the greenbelt clicked uselessly without pressure. Paper power had carried them this far. But real authority had just arrived with a clipboard and a map. As vehicles pulled away and neighbors dispersed, the floating platform sat motionless against the dockless shoreline. For weeks the HOA had escalated fines, threatened foreclosure, and labeled me non-compliant. Now they were the ones facing documentation requests. And documentation never argues. It only calculates. The lake settled back into silence. But the numbers, daily operation totals, reporting failures, jurisdictional violations, were only beginning to surface. How much would it cost the board once every day of unauthorized operation was counted? The letters arrived 3 weeks later. Not one envelope, several. Different headers. Different offices. Same subject line, notice of determination. The first confirmed jurisdiction. The basin connected to a monitored drainage channel, and the installed pump qualified as mechanical withdrawal equipment operating without prior authorization. Operation records would be calculated from installation date to shutdown date using capacity ratings and runtime estimates. The second outline required corrective action. Immediate prohibition of further operation. Engineering assessment of shoreline disturbance. Restoration plan subject to approval before any modification of the water level could occur again. The third letter mattered most to the board. Civil penalties assessed per day of unauthorized operation. The total wasn't printed yet, only the formula, but the multiplication factor alone made the HOA attorney request an emergency meeting. Insurance was contacted first. Insurance declined coverage. Unauthorized infrastructure, installed without required regulatory approval, fell outside policy protection. Liability reverted to the association, and potentially to individual board decisions depending on authorization records. The lien process against my property was formally withdrawn the same day. The county clerk recorded a correction notice, enforcement actions based on invalid authority claim. A week later the association's contractors sent their own letter. They were terminating their service agreement pending investigation into project authorization representations made at contract signing. Without contractor backing and without insurance coverage, the board's position shifted from enforcement to containment. At the emergency meeting, attendance filled every seat. The attorney explained exposure in careful language, restoration costs, compliance engineering, and assessed penalties would be charged to the association budget unless proven outside board authorization. The bylaws didn't allow special assessments for illegal projects, which meant the cost couldn't simply be distributed quietly. Board members began resigning before the meeting ended. The president remained until the end of the session, insisting the project improved property values and would have been approved eventually. But regulatory violations don't consider intentions, only timing and authority. The association voted to cooperate fully with restoration requirements and retain independent counsel. 2 months later excavation crews returned, this time to remove the platform. They restored the shoreline grade under supervision and capped the pipeline leading into the greenbelt. Grass was replanted. The waterline stabilized naturally over the following weeks. A certified letter arrived addressed to me last. The association acknowledged improper enforcement actions, cleared all assessments, and reimbursed documented legal consultation costs. No apology language, just confirmation. Consequences didn't look dramatic. No arrests. No shouting. Just signatures, withdrawals, and financial obligations transferring back to the people who approved the project. Authority corrected itself the same way it had been misused, on paper. The lake returned to reflecting trees instead of equipment. And the board that once claimed control over it no longer had authority to meet it all. When enforcement depends on rules, what happens after the people enforcing them ignore the biggest one? By the end of the season, the water looked the way I remembered it. No fences. No warning signs. Just a quiet line where the shoreline met the trees. The new grass along the bank hadn't fully grown in yet, but you could already see the path the excavators had erased. Fish returned first, small ripples near sunset, then deeper movement farther out. Neighbors started stopping again. Not to ask questions this time, just short conversations about weather, yard work, normal things. A few mentioned the new interim board reviewing policies before approving anything involving shared property. Meetings were quieter now. I rebuilt the dock using the old measurements I still had saved. Before tightening the last bolt, I mounted the small metal plaque my father kept on his tackle box, the one he carried to every lake we ever fished together. Nothing about the place needed to prove a point anymore. Paperwork had done that already. I sat at the end of the boards one evening and watched the water settle into stillness again. Some battles end loudly. The important ones end permanently. Rules only matter when they apply to the people who wrote them.